Today on the Roundhouse, we're trading places with the California State Railroad Museum to talk about photographers Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 123 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we talk about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we're doing something a little different. I was contacted by the California State Railroad Museum, which hosts the Roundhouse Crosstalk Podcast. And they were interested in collaborating together. And so, as a result, they're featuring the Roundhouse episode covering railroads online. And we are featuring their episode on photographers Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg. They interviewed author Tony Reevy, who wrote a book on these two noted railroad photographers. So we're going to hear about their fascinating personal and professional histories and why they left such a mark on the world of railroad photography. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank all of you guys who support the Roundhouse on Patreon. Patreon.com/The Roundhouse. For as little as $1 a month, you're going to be supporting the podcast and what we do here. I'm really appreciative of everything that you guys do to support the show. And even if you can't support it financially, just sharing the podcast with a few other people, sharing it on your social media, or just even leaving a review on places like Apple Podcasts goes a long way. I really appreciate the feedback, and I love making sure that we're having the conversations that you want to hear.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. June is Pride Month, and to usher it in today, we will be talking to Tony Reevy about Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg, owners of the luxurious Gold Coast private railcar that we house right here at the museum. Beebe and Clegg were not only influential train photographers, but also icons of high society and some of the earliest and most famous gay men to live openly in American history. Stay tuned to hear about their celebrity lifestyle as well as their influence on railroad photography. All right. Well, first question, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for this interview. I'm excited to talk about Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg. And my name is Tony Reevy, and I work for North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I live in Durham, and Durham, North Carolina. I've lived here more or less since I was 14. Mm-hmm. And I've been writing about American railroads for a long time, about 30 years, and in the last 10 years or so have done a series of books on railroad subject photographers I feel are important, and they've been O. Winston Link, Jack Delano, Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg. And in the fall, hopefully, of 2023, I'll have another one coming out that's related to the museum, which is Phil Hastings. I also write poetry, but that's another story.
And what got you interested in railroad photography specifically?
Well, the interest in railroads came first, and like with a lot of folks, particularly of my generation or the generation or two older than me, it has to do with Lucius Beebe. One of the first things I remember about railroads was, and this is in the preface to the book, if I'm not mistaken, was seeing a book called Highball not one of Lucius Beebe's best known or first books, but in my dad's books. My dad was a book collector, and I just love looking through that book. I lived near a train track as well at the time, and I just got interested. Neither of my parents had anything to do with the railroad industry, and I've never worked in the railroad industry either. So it was completely an avocational interest and didn't come from a family background. But many folks in the U.S. and beyond the U.S. share this interest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so what got you interested specifically in Beebe and Clegg? Was that also just from the railroad photography?
So, and you'll hear this again, you'll hear this from a lot of folks in my generation or older. Until this book, I think Lucius and Charles were a little, or Chuck as he went by, were a little less known than they had been. But I hope this book and you all's collections might make a difference in this. But in my generation and older, he was probably the best known author about railroads. If you read Trains magazine, and I did that from time to time, but I didn't subscribe, you probably also knew about a man named David P. Morgan, who was the editor of Trains. But Lucius Beebe, along in some cases with Charles Clegg, did something like 30 books about railroads. And so he was just the best known author about railroads. And his books were they still are. His books are plentiful and common. Many of them were bestsellers when they came out. They were easily available from in my generation from sort of second reprint publishers like Bonanza. They were also common in used bookstores, and today they're very common on eBay and Amazon. So they're one of the ways that folks found out about railroad subject photography and even railroads. And that's certainly the case for me. And again, back to the same story. I mean, the first Lucius Beebe book I encountered while I was probably 3 or 4 was my father's copy of Highball. My dad was not particularly interested in railroads, but he was an inveterate book buyer, and he just happened to pick that one up. And it's not one of his best known books, but it's still one of my favorite books by Lucius Beebe.
And what is it about Highball that you particularly love? Like, what are the aspects of the photography?
That's one of his 2 or 3 books that had, I think this is a fair statement, had stories about railroad workers in it. And again, although I obviously I wasn't thinking about it that way then, I mean, everybody, children and otherwise, likes the appeal of a good story. And Highball is one of the books where he tells stories about railroads and railroad workers, I think, in a very effective way. Mm-hmm. Some of his books do that more than others.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Lucius Beebe's background. He particularly had a very privileged background. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So Lucius Beebe and both of his life partners shared this. He came from a very privileged background. He was from Massachusetts, and on both sides of his family, his folks came over really early. His family was in the leather business. They made a lot of money making leather goods for the Union Army and the Civil War. Obviously, Massachusetts was a Union state. Then his father particularly diversified their investments into apple orchards and most what people would expect from what Lucius did into railroads and other things. And so Lucius, it's hard to imagine today making a living from books like what Lucius did, but he made enough from his books to make a great living. Mm. So the money he got from his family wealth added on to that.
And he attended both Harvard and Yale, right?
He attended both. He was thrown out of Yale because he was a ardent opponent, not proponent, but ardent opponent of prohibition. And there was a professor at Yale who was very much in favor of prohibition, of the temperance movement. And Lucius, dressed up like him, went to a theater performance and tossed an empty liquor bottle from the balcony onto the stage. And, that today would not get you thrown out of a university, but it did then. And so he went on to Harvard and graduated there. And then he stayed on, and this is something I think very few people know about him. He wrote poetry, he wrote poetry criticism, and he stayed on at Harvard to get what we would today call a master's in English or master's of creative writing, or MFA, something like that. And he was thrown out of Harvard too, and never finished his graduate degree because he got into a fight with a fellow student who told the poet Edward Arlington Robinson that Lucius had published some of his work without his permission. So his college career was rather checkered. So was his, as you might expect from his background. He went to prep schools, and he was thrown out of one for dynamiting incident, and he was thrown out of another one for a drinking incident, and finally finished at a third one. But his life took an unexpected, at least I think to the people around him and people reading about him, unexpected turn after he had to leave Harvard. He made a living for himself and became a reporter. And so that, when you look at this life of privilege, that was probably an unexpected turn. He went ahead and made a living for himself. And as I think back on it, that's something that he had in common with Charles Clegg, actually.
Yeah. And so when he went on to make that living in journalism, I think the term from your book, was it cafe society? Was it cafe culture, something like that?
Well, so he was a writer and journalist from the time he left Harvard until he died, which I think was in 1966, was in the mid 60s. He would always made a living as a writer after that. He started out as a general assignment reporter, and he was at several papers, but he's most closely associated with the New York Herald Tribune, I think it was at the time. And he started there. I mean, they tried him out in a number of things: general assignment reporter, drama reporter. He once went to cover a fire as a general assignment reporter in a Top Hat and Tails. And eventually this was not Lucius's idea from my research. His editor came up with the idea of having Lucius be something that was really big at the time, but you don't see that much anymore. And that was, he was what I'd call a gossip or society columnist. And there were a number of those around at the time. There was a woman who covered New York. There was a man, I think, named Maury Knickerbocker or something like that. So this was a big part of newspapers at the time. People liked to read about sort of the shenanigans of the wealthy few. And Lucius took this assignment and took it to heart, and in fact was a gossip columnist for over 10 years. And he wrote a column called This New York, which his workday was kind of as follows. He would get up at about lunchtime, stay around the apartment, go off for the cocktail hour and dinner and drinks after dinner, maybe a show, play, movie, something like that. And then he would go home and type up a gossip column. And most of what that was talking about the folks he saw, like at the 21 Club, et cetera. And so he did that every weekday for over a decade. And his column was very popular, he had a couple of close competitors for other newspapers. Their columns were popular as well. And he either coined the phrase cafe society or certainly popularized it. So one thing that there are a lot of coffee houses called Cafe Society, and they owe a debt to Lucius Beebe, I think, without ever even knowing it.
Mm-hmm. I gotta say, he's such an interesting person to learn about.
And he's not just important for railroad photography or railroad history. He's important for understanding New York and the society just during and just after Prohibition. Mm-hmm. His partner, Charles Clegg, was in the military in World War II. I mean, they were a pretty much openly what we now call gay couple at the time. I mean, there are just so many facets to Lucius. His politics were the opposite of what you would expect from a gossip columnist of Cafe Society who also was what we now call a gay man, because he was very conservative. Mm-hmm. So he was a man of great complexity. Mm-hmm. He was also one of the first food critics in the US. So, the list just goes on and on.
An extremely influential person.
Yes, although also even still fairly forgotten.
Yeah, it's interesting.
He was a friend of James Beard's, for example, and when you hear about the beginnings of food culture in the United States and so on, you hear about James Beard and Julia Child, but you never hear about Lucius Beebe.
Lucius Beebe was so well known for his sense of style that he was even featured in popular music. For example, this is Mr. Beebe, with lyrics by Sammy Cahn and music by Jewel Stein and Dudley Brooks. It appeared in the 1944 film Carolina Blues.
Mr. Beebe, he's the man who knows. Mr. Beebe sets the style in clothes, fancy cravats and those knocked out spats. Beebe's the man who knows. Mr. Beebe, dig the boutonniere. Mr. Beebe, booted front and rear. Harlem's alive to his dressed up jive. Beebe's the man who knows. Now I've heard them say.
Here's the paradox: given how little known he is today, except perhaps by railroad enthusiasts, it's looking back, it's kind of hard to assess how well known he was at the time. But I mean, some markers on that. He was very good friends with Clifton Webb, and although not the actions of the character in Laura, the murderous gossip columnist in Laura, those didn't reflect Lucius Beebe, but the occupation, dress, and circles that he moved in of that character, to me, were obviously come from Lucius Beebe. He was featured in a song. There's a movie called Cafe Society, which it seems to be based upon Lucius and one of his female friends, and so he was and he was a gospel columnist in one of the most important papers in the country, and in what was, and I would argue is still, the most important city in the country, New York. So he was on the cover of Time magazine, wearing top hat and so on. So he was very well known, very influential, both in people's view of New York City, people's view of the American Railroad, in formal dress, and frankly, something I didn't get to explore much in what I wrote, but in American food culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you may or may not know this. I'm just kind of curious. I was watching the video for the song Mr. Beebe, and they talk a lot about Harlem, and they're singing about Harlem, and the setting is obviously Harlem. So did he work and live in Harlem?
No, he didn't. He lived in an apartment in a fashionable part of New York, and then he mostly hung out in the popular nightclubs of the time, which almost all came from speakeasies, speakeasies that were then legitimized when Prohibition was repealed in 1933. So, that's like the 21 Club, El Morocco, those kinds of places.
So we've talked a little bit about Charles Clegg, his life partner. How did Lucius Beebe meet Charles Clegg?
Right. So Lucius actually had two life partners, Jerome Zerby, in the 30s, and then Charles Clegg. Dates differ, but they met in right before World War II, so either in 1940 or 1941. That's another story, like the dynamiting and so on. So Lucius was very good friends with Evelyn Walsh McLean, and so if you think of one of the most affluent suburbs of Washington, D.C., McLean, Virginia, that's named after her father. So she owned the Hope Diamond. She had a mansion in DC. And so Charles Clegg, so she had numerous parties. She was very much a socialite. She would often wear the Hope Diamond, which she owned, at her parties. I'm sure that gave her insurance company nightmares. But so she was a friend of Lucius's. Charles Clegg, who was much younger, showed up at a party as the guest of J. Edgar Hoover, and Lucius was there. Lucius was, I don't think you could call him an alcoholic, but he was often a heavy drinker. So Charles Clegg and Lucius ended up spending the night. They were in adjacent rooms in the mansion that shared a bathroom, and Charles Clegg got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and he found Lucius Beebe passed out in the bathtub in the bathroom they shared, clutching a broken china pig, and he had cut himself on the broken china pig. So Charles Clegg cleaned him up, put him to bed, and then he went back to bed and smoked a cigarette in bed, as people often did back then, and set the bed on fire. So after that night, Evelyn Walsh McLean said, "You can come to my parties, but you can't stay overnight anymore." So that's how they met.
What a meeting story. I love that.
I suspect they had both had a few drinks, and that's why they had to spend the night. And so Charles Clegg ducked J. Edgar Hoover and found Lucius Beebe.
It's like a rom-com. Like, what a funny way to meet someone.
Well, I know it wasn't in the questions, but Lucius's first partner, Jerome Zerby, is considered the first paparazzi photographer. So yeah.
He has very specific taste. Yes.
Yeah.
And so how, both with his first partner and his second partner, how did he manage having those relationships in a society where homosexuality was not accepted yet?
He's got to be one of the first fairly prominent, openly gay men, of American history. And your question really led me to think this through even a little bit more. I mean, in the book, I say that his wealth allowed him to sort of stand aside from convention. And I think that's true. Mm-hmm. I mean, if he hadn't been able to make a living as an author, he still would have been able to live on the income from his inheritance. So there's that. And then, although he was writing for rail enthusiasts who tend to be conservative, he was a writer. And I think writers in society have often been allowed a little more freedom. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, if you look at where he lived, he lived in, first of all, he lived in fashionable parts of New York, which, although it was not open at the time at all, became the cornerstone of the gay rights movement with Stonewall just about 20 years after Lucius moved out of New York. Mm-hmm. So there's that. And then he moved to Virginia City, Nevada, which was well known as sort of a stomping ground for eccentric, usually affluent people. And then the one I know the least about and wondered the most about is that he ended his life living in a suburb of San Francisco. And I think of San Francisco at the time conservative, but of course the other historic center of the gay rights movement in the United States, I'd argue it beyond New York, is San Francisco. So, he lived in New York, Virginia City, and San Francisco. And the term gay was not in use at the time. Mm-hmm. The Stonewall riots hadn't happened yet. Mm-hmm. He did it's not that great a book, but it's an interesting book if you want to understand Lucius's relationships called Snoot If You Must, where there's a chapter where Charles Clegg joins the Navy right after Pearl Harbor, and Lucius talks about basically missing him while he's in the Navy. And so that's pretty out there for that book, if I'm not mistaken, was published in 1943. So that's pretty out there for 1943.
Definitely.
And he also said that he often said that Charles Clegg was his partner. I mean, to railroad subject readers, I mean, they probably took that as his partner in writing books, but obviously Lucius, at least in a covert manner, meant that in a broader sense. And there are those that argue that he was the first prominent writer to use partner in that sense. So gay folks, gay and lesbian folks, then were typically in fairly deep closet, I guess you'd call it. And so, this is a really intriguing part of his life that really hasn't been explored that much.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go on the webs, you'll see a lot of kind of informal stuff, like he's one of the main people profiled in a site called, I think it's Dandyism. So, he's got a following there, as well as with people who are interested in the history of American food criticism, and with people who are interested in American railroads. So, which is a really interesting and even strange combination, right?
Yeah. I think it's very interesting how his life has all these flashes, like of foreshadowing modern gay culture, where living in New York, living in San Francisco, using the word partner, the kind of lifestyle that he led. It's very it's fascinating.
That's a very I think that's a very perceptive comment. And one of the folks that I interviewed for the original article that led to the book almost came out and those interviews were done more than 15 years ago. So it was even more than 15 years ago was different than now. I mean, gay marriage is fairly accepted in many places now. That wasn't true 15 years ago. And in one of the interviews, I think it was John White, talked about how Lucius seemed sad because he didn't fulfill society's expectations of having a home and children and so on. And I remember thinking that's a kind of very perceptive, but also very coded, what the person I interviewed said.
In partnership with the First Partners Office and the Natural Resources Agency, the California State Park Adventure Pass provides free entry for 4th graders and their families at 19 amazing state parks throughout California, including the California State Railroad Museum. Passes are valid until August of 2022. To sign up, visit reservecalifornia.com. You can find out more about the Adventure Pass at parks.ca.gov/adventurepass.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or railcar project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, railcar, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you to get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you.
Now I'd like to turn our conversation a bit more towards the railroad photography itself.
Right, okay.
So what is the significance of the book High Iron?
Right. So the other thing about Lucius, there are thousands of them, and they cover just about, it's hard to find a railroad that's not covered with what I'm going to call a railroad picture book, right? Anybody who's interested in railroads know what I'm talking about. They're almost always in a 9x12 or 8.5x11 format, and they're almost always more heavy with images than words. And Lucius wrote the first such book in 1938, High Iron. So there was one book that came before it called Trains by Robert Self Henry that's kind of in that category, but Lucius's books set the standard in that there's often just one photo per page. Each photo has a caption. There's, at the beginning of each chapter of photos, there's text that talks about the chapter. I mean, even all the books I've done fall into this category, right? So he started this, and, you know, thousands of books have followed his format. What I would say he did is he took the approach of the art photography book, like think about American Photographs by Walker Evans, which came out the same year, if I'm not mistaken, and applied it to railroad subject photographs. And, you know, that doesn't seem like any big deal now, but it was the first one.
And then Mixed Train Daily is also one of his famous books. Did his style change at all between those publishings? What's different or similar about the two?
Well, so that is the book. I mean, obviously now we're into subjective judgment, but I think that's his best book. And he did it with Charles Clegg. And I think so his writing style, which was kind of Baroque, but I think it's almost coming back into fashion. When I read, I know a lot of rail fans are going to jump on me for this, but when I read David P. Morgan now, who had a very almost Hemingway writing style, you know, very factual, very direct, and I read Lucius Beebe, who had almost a Dickinson writing style. To me, Lucius Beebe's writing is starting to sound more contemporary. In some ways, or certainly sounds better to my ear than it did, say, even 20 years ago. So what changed was the photographs. A lot in his early books, Lucius used what railroad subject photographers call a wedge shot, kind of shooting straight on at the side from a locomotive. And believe it or not, that was kind of innovative in the late 30s, because before that, people mostly did roster shots, which they got unmoving photos just of the locomotive. The focus was all on the locomotive. And so he got action shots actually showing the train out in the field. But what you see in Mixed Train Daily, and to some extent in Highball, was what I call, and have called for a long time, environmental railroad photography, where the whole scene is taken in. And that influence, to me, certainly comes from Charles Clegg, who, unlike Lucius Beebe, had some formal training as a photographer. And it's partly a photo. You can partly see the influence of photojournalism, and partly see the influence, I think, of folks who took landscape scenes even more broadly than that, like some of the Farm Security Administration photographers. And so Charles Clegg, having had formal photography training, would have encountered images like that. And so he was clearly, and Lucius started taking some images like that as well. So Charles Clegg was an influence on Lucius Beebe in photography as well. That's and it's just the other thing. They spent 3-4 years on this book, and it is not. I mean, a lot of the other books are marred by what I'm going to call, not very complete research. If you're someone who does quite a bit of writing, you can kind of look at it and tell it was rushed. And Mixed Train Daily is not like that at all. And High Iron isn't either. He spent a couple of years, I think, on that book, 2 or 3 years in that book. So, it really makes it, really makes a difference if you spend a lot of time with your subject like that.
And did their work in Mixed Train Daily and their other books, did that significantly influence how railroad photography is done today?
Oh, I would say absolutely. In two major ways. The first was came early, and it was the move away from sort of the engine picture club trading roster photos kind of thing into taking the time and having the proper equipment to go out in the field and take field images of trains. And then, so that was the first big development, and Lucius Beebe was pretty paramount in popularizing that. And then the second big development, and this is one that you still see in railroad subject photography today, was to step back. And I credit Charles Clegg with this, to step back and situate the railroad in the American scene, which, many people have called it many things. I call it environmental railroad photography, but stepping back and situating the American railroad in the scene. And that Charles Clegg's work in that sense influenced Lucius Beebe, but it also really influenced another of your major collections, certainly influenced Phil Hastings. And then Phil Hastings had, how things carry on. I mean, Phil Hastings had a huge influence on David Plowden and Jim Shaughnessy, who was kind of his protege. And today you still see a lot of wedge shots, but you see a lot of very innovative images using the railroad as part of the American scene. So it wasn't just stepping back and doing that. It was also the influence that photographs, particularly by Clegg in books like Mixed Train Daily, had on those who came after him. I mean, I should also mention Richard Dick Steinheimer, who was from California, where I think you're sitting right now, and I know Winston Link is other folks who were very influenced by, particularly by Charles Clegg's photography. And you still see, I mean, railroad subject photography today, I see a couple of trends. One is to do sort of modernist or postmodernist views that really focus in on pieces, but you still also have this movement that today is exemplified by folks by Scott Lotus, who are still stepping back, or Jim Wren, who's still stepping back and taking images, or Jeff Browse, that look like images that, given the differences in camera technology, Charles Clegg could have taken.
And so why did they stop making these railroad photography books around like 1950? What happened?
So there's a difference between churning out books and taking photos. So Lucius, with or without Charles Clegg, was incredibly productive starting in about 1938 until he died in the mid 60s. And, he was at a pace of about a book every year, a little bit more than a book every year. So, and as I said, frankly, some of the books really suffer from seeming to be rushed. Now, there are a couple of them, like you have a private car associated with Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg there. A couple of his books, like Mansions on Rails and Mr. Pullman's Elegant Pounce Car, are about subjects, private cars, the Pullman Company, that in the case of private cars still really hasn't been written about much more. And then in the case of the Pullman Company, hadn't been written about much except by Lucius until recent years. And the lens now is more on the role of the Pullman Company in fostering the civil rights movement through creating a Black middle class through Pullman porters, which is a very different lens than what Lucius did. So he had some very significant subjects, but in terms of actual photography, if you look through the collection, which your museum holds, there's not much done after about 1950. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is the stated reason, and the other is another reason. One is Lucius and Charles Clegg are are examples that, there were railroad photographers whose enthusiasm survived the end of steam on the U.S. railroad, and there are ones who didn't. And for example, Jim Shaughnessy kept taking photos after the end of steam of American railroads, but many photographers didn't. And Lucius and Beebe and Charles Clegg kind of fall in that latter category. They seem to some extent lose the interest once steam left the rails in the U.S. But I think there was another thing going on, and that is that Lucius is, this is probably partly lifestyle related, but his health for probably the last 8 to 10 years of his life wasn't that good. And, railroad subject photography in the kind of places that Lucius went, like the Deep South, like Donner Pass and so on, is it's not taken lightly, right? You have to stay out in the desert, wait for a train, etc. So I think also what happened there is it just got harder and more uncomfortable for him to take photos in the field.
And you mentioned their private car that we have right here at the museum, the Gold Coast.
Right.
What can you tell us about the Gold Coast?
So they, in their lives, Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg owned 2 private cars. The first was the Gold Coast, which you have there. And in fact, when they first moved to to Nevada from New York, I believe they lived in that car for a while, or at least lived there while they were in the Virginia City area. And it's an older car that is not all steel. And so as railroads moved to not be willing to haul passenger cars in interstate commerce that were not all steel cars, they gave that away, I think. And of course, the museum didn't exist at the time. I think they may have given it to the Pacific Coast chapter of Railway and Locomotive Historical Society. You'll have to look that up for me, but I think that's right. And then it came to you from there. And they went ahead and bought another private car that was all steel, and was a Pullman Standard car that was built for the Great Northern. And both of these cars, when they bought them, they had them redone in the style they liked, which I like many things about Lucius Beebe's writing and photography, but I'm not a big proponent of the style. He and Clegg called it Renaissance Baroque, but several of their friends at the time said it looked like a Nevada bordello. And that's, I think the Gold Coast is still in that style, right? So yeah, the Gold Coast, the car that's not all steel, is at your museum. And then the last I heard, the other car was still operating and still available for folks to rent to use. I mean, Amtrak a couple of years ago made it much harder to use private cars. So I'm not sure what's happened to the Virginia City is the name of the other car since that happened. But as of when I was working on the book, it was still available for people to use as a private car. At one point, I mean, another thing Lucius and Charles did, for what it's worth, is at one point they had one of the few private cars left in the US. And until this action by Amtrak a couple of years ago, there were quite a few around. So they also kind of kept the tradition of the American private car going.
I think this is another interesting example of, Lucius Beebe being involved in a foreshadowing of some other historical event, because the Gold Coast is how they helped convince Ronald Reagan to, approve having a railroad museum. They had that dinner in the Gold Coast. Yes,
that's the meeting that led to the creation of your museum was held in the car, and of course played to the pro sort of Western cinemas that obviously a former actor from Western movies might have. So it played a great role, and you can see it in the museum today. And so you see both a part of history of the museum and a part of the history of Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg.
It feels like no matter where you look in railroad history, you're going to see Lucius Beebe somewhere in there now.
Well, I think that's a very perceptive comment. The other thing about Mixed Train Daily is, in those 3 years or so during and right, hard to imagine. I mean, talk about wealth, they did part of the work for this book during World War II. So how did they get tires and gasoline, right? But, they went all over the country. I mean, there are photos in there from the Deep South. There's photos from New England, the Northeast, the places that you don't see photos of very often, like the Upper Midwest, the West. I mean, the Deep South and the West were clearly favorites of theirs, but there are photos from just about all the areas of the United States in that book.
So based on their style and based on their tastes and, Lucius Beebe's political views, they seem like kind of nostalgic people, which is an interesting contrast to other aspects of their lifestyle.
I felt that deeply as I read the book, because Lucius is, and later in his life, Lucius, for one of the San Francisco papers, got a column, had a regular column as well. I think it was, instead of This New York, I think it may have been called This Wild West. Mm-hmm. And, if you read those columns today, they can seem very contemporary, because they're very right-wing, conservative, pro-market, I would even say sort of pro 1870s Gilded Age robber baron, sort of the opposite of Mark Twain's writings. And so it's, frankly, it's something you might expect perhaps from a person who comes from longstanding wealth, yes, but do you expect this coming from someone who basically made a living as a writer and who was a fairly openly gay man before you could really, before that was even really thought of in most circles? So it's a really interesting and even strange contrast. We associate gay rights with progressive political ideas, but did he? I don't know if we know the answer to that question. That they're, we're trying to understand his viewpoints from where we sit. But it seemed, as I went through the book, it seemed very strange. This contrast in his political views and his personal life. One of my purposes in doing this book was to try to revive Lucius Beebe and even Charles Clegg's reputations a bit. Mm-hmm. I think that younger rail enthusiasts were not that familiar with him. All of his books, they're easily available used, but they were basically, except for maybe the Stork Club Bar book, which he also wrote, were basically out of print. The Center for Railroad Photography and Art also did an excellent book about Lucius. So all of a sudden, two sort of art photography books about Lucius are available, when before there really hadn't been any in print. So I purposely wanted to try to incent people to take a look back at him. But the other thing is, in addition to wanting people to look back at him as a cultural icon, right, and as a exemplar of the beginnings of the gay rights movement, the beginnings of fine dining in the United States, the end of prohibition, and kind of the end of the newspaper, perhaps, as the main communications vehicle in the country. And I think he still deserves a closer look.
Thank you for listening to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. If you're interested in seeing a piece of Beebe and Clegg's life in person, you can visit the Gold Coast right here at the museum. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Goodbye, everybody, and happy Pride Month.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, we were talking to Ken Marty, the president of West Coast Railroaders Group, a company that uses speeders, little track cars, for all sorts of services, from inspection to a lot of charitable work as well. And there were some really great stories that Ken shared about the work that his company has done with organizations like the Make-A-Wish Foundation. This led to the question of the day: what is an event or organization that you've been part of that benefited your community? And for this, I was looking for answers even outside of things pertaining to railroading. A couple of responses to share with you. First, from Kevin Jenner, Glassboro Historical Society. They restored and maintain the old railroad depot. I'm unable to be involved with railroad preservation groups due to my limited schedule, but I'm always able to head down to the depot to help run an event, and I always leave there satisfied with the hours I volunteer. Convenience of scheduling is definitely a good observation, Kevin. I myself volunteer at a local humane society doing dog walking, and they're very accommodating to people's schedules as far as when people can show up to walk dogs or socialize with cats. So that is something from organizations to be mindful of, is how can they accommodate people's schedules, especially those of us who are busy. Joe Fox writes, WWNF Railway Museum. Been an active volunteer with them since 2005. Truly a great experience and a great group of volunteers. Joe, it was great meeting you. Joe was such a great guy when I had the opportunity to meet him at the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington this past August for their annual picnic event and a photo charter. Super nice guy, showed me around their number 9 steam locomotive. And as you recall, we covered the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington way back in January, so you can check out that episode. Your question of the day for this episode is, who is your favorite railroad author? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com, where we have our links to social media, or you can just comment on the post itself. I appreciate you guys tuning in every month to the adventures and conversations we have at the Roundhouse. It's so great to have you along for the ride. Thank you, and remember that the Roundhouse is our house.